Welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. My guest today is Christopher Mastropietro. Did I say that? Capture that right?
Mastropietro.
Mastropietro. Sorry about that. As somebody else who has a horrible last name that gets mangled all the time, at least I can empathize.
We're kindred spirits in that respect, Gregg.
Amen. Well, it's a really joy to have you here. In fact, we've been having a fun conversation up to this point. I want to welcome you here, and we have all sorts of different things to talk about. But first, just welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Gregg. Thank you. It was a really kind invitation to come and chat with you here on your podcast. It really was, and I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun to do. So just where we are in time right now, we've just finished doing the Elusive, the 13 part. Yep. I've lost track series. The Elusive
12 plus 1. We have 13 part coming up, I think, on Thursday.
So we've just finished the 12-part series. It went awfully fast, actually, for the length and volume. It did seem to kind of speed by. Anyway, that was really a pleasure and an honor to do that with you and John, Gregg. So thank you for that as well. You were remarkably accommodating of me in that process as we waded through it together.
I wouldn't say I felt that particularly. What I did feel, I want you to know, I was genuinely, and I think this showed, but I want you to know this deeply. I was really moved by the last two presentations the last two. So Chris takes the last two and he articulates the angle from a existential Kierkegaardian perspective. And just one note after another captured my attention and just resonated with me very, very deeply. So it was an honor to watch that, and it was moving to feel that. And I felt a deep resonance with a cognitive science, clinical, existential interface on this very, very tricky concept. And it just brought the discussion to a real philosophical, embodied, existential head. And I just deeply appreciated that contribution. It was really remarkable.
Oh, thank you, Gregg. That's very kind. Thank you for saying that. Very much. Very much. I mean, it was embarrassment of riches, that series, because there's so much, it's like you pull on any one of those threads. Every 5 minutes could have unspooled itself into yet another hour, right? Even the tangential richness of those sessions is enough to be very whelming. And that in and of itself made it a very interesting exercise, right? Because it's an exercise of constantly expanding the ambit of content under discussion and under the scope of attention, and then having to contract it again so that it remains intelligible. And that constant expanding and contracting of the scope of discussion is it's a real challenge. But when done with a certain degree of attention, it can be a really worthwhile challenge. And I felt that was the case.
That was totally my sense. And I think you and I were given that in particular, sort of like, because we had a somewhat more narrow band with which we both wanted to expand, but maintain intelligible and maintain the connection. But it did seem to come together quite well. I'm very happy with the product. And I really also am, I'm really grateful for John and setting it up and initiating this concept of sort of academic dialogos, this process of rich dialogue to unfold insight. And it's a real, joy to be a part of that, because I really do feel the Zoom world and other changes in society afford us an opportunity, to rediscover perhaps some modes of inquiry and connection that have been lost in traditional academic circles, at least in modernity, and to remember those and rediscover those and reenact those is what I feel sort of like that project is about. And it's pretty cool to be a part of.
It is, yeah. It's one of the things that makes this whole enterprise deeply attractive on so many different levels, because it speaks to the deep appetition that we're all feeling to somehow get outside of the narrow, constricting frame of reference, right? That we've all been indentured to, having inherited it, right, from modernity. And that's why there are so many disaffected people who have gone to do an undergraduate degree and found that all of the things that were subject to their intellectual lust ended up being withheld from them in one way or another, and so had to that, I mean, it's such a prevailing problem now that it has now assumed, right, that fundamental problem because of its prevalence. It's now just, we almost take it as a given.
Sort of the default. It is the default that unfolds, right?
That's right. That's right. But it's funny. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is that one thing that I found, I mean, John was certainly the one who pulled me into this world. And I was and am still very grateful to him for that. And since that, I've tried to find the most optimal way to comport the experience of encountering it, because I mean it when I say it's an embarrassment of riches, and that the volume, the sheer volume and variety of what is available, and by what is available, I mean both the content of thought that's being advanced and also the individuals, the variety of different people who are operating within the space, is it risks, to use John's language, risks being combinatorially explosive, right? It's really quite something.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
It's such a groundswell. It's such a surge. And there's a deep appeal to that, of course. But there's also, I find that there's a countervailing instinct to be very cautious about it too, because there is simply so much, sort of like being at a sumptuous buffet. And your first instinct, most people's first instincts, is to want to just be voracious and attack that buffet for all it's worth and to try and stack as many things on that plate as possible. But of course, structuring a proper meal is an art unto itself, and one worth cultivating, right? Because otherwise you get a severe case of indigestion after the fact. And I find that there's, that's a crude analogy, but there's something that here, I think, for me. And so, taking care to curate the experience is, I think, a challenge that is an implicit part of the experience itself, and an implicit part of the virtual environment is the question of personal curation.
Yes.
And that to me is as deserving of attention as the actual participation in the dialogues, right? Because depending on how you curate the participation, the experience will be very different, and the learning therein will be very different too, right? And so I found that now it's easier for me to be a little bit more parsimonious about this, because I don't have the breadth of possible participation that you and John and others have. But nevertheless, a certain parsimony I found almost necessary in order to make sure that each experience and each encounter is meaningful unto itself and can sufficiently account for itself and its value, and doesn't get drowned out by the sheer, the sheer abundance of it all. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that I've talked to a couple of people who have experienced that stuffness and indigestion, and even then psychically found themselves overwhelmed and confused as a function of, indulging almost in a hypomanic state of, oh my gosh, and then all of a sudden finding yourself having consumed so much different variety without participate the meal, so that the metabolism is cumulative rather than overloading and then capturing the stuckness of the felt sense of being that can't then be metabolized, and then being like, now what? I can't even appreciate anything anymore because I have no way to metabolize what it is that I'm actually encountering. I have the sense that it's good, but I'm now done and I'm tapped out. I've talked to a couple of young men in particular who were feeding off of this, who actually encountered that process, and I coached them through a little bit in my own way. I feel super fortunate in my own space because, my journey is building an architecture. So I build an underlying architecture so I already had this backdrop cathedral to suck up. So if I'm going to go drop into quantum mechanics and, metabolize what's happening in that literature, I already have aspectualizing frame for sucking that literature up and placing it in particular categories. And I can then drop that. And I spent half the day on Jewish mysticism because John hooked me into Zevi Slavin. I hope I'm saying his name. All right. And I spent 3 hours with him today earlier. And then I listened. Yeah, it's beautiful. And then what is that world? And fundamentally, how do I understand that world? And again, though, I'm lucky, fortunate, except whatever, having an architecture that allows me to assimilate, integrate, categorize, affords me an opportunity to eat pretty voraciously off the buffet without getting massive indigestion and backup. But that has a lot to do with understanding an architecture that allows you to assimilate and integrate key ideas and harmonize them so that you get music rather than just, oh my God, that's an idea. And oh my God, that's an idea. But if you can't discern how to place that idea in relation, the system will get overloaded and you will find yourself, stuck with a meal you can't digest.
That's right. Well, that's right. Well put. Well put. No, that makes a lot of sense that you come in with a certain structure that constrains the number of ways in which the new information, for lack of a better word, can be signified to you.
Yep.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I think that is precisely the thing that a lot of people coming in, part of it's generational, people coming in who are younger, but also people who are coming in without the same training, and the same, I suppose, the same set of axioms within which to work would be much more suggestible and therefore much more susceptible to being overwhelmed. Framing it in terms of metabolism, that's very helpful. That's very helpful.
Mm. Yeah, and I do feel, I do have a very ingrained architecture that sorts the various nutrients and allows me to metabolize them in process that's energizing as opposed to overwhelming. So that's why I'm a pig in shit in this. I'm a happy camper, but I'm not what you describe is not an uncommon phenomenon as I encounter people, definitely.
Let me ask you, Gregg, there's been so much obvious confluence between your metapsychological architecture that you've brought to all of this and the tree of knowledge and all of your painstaking work over the course of time to elaborate and articulate it out to be as expansive as possible, without perhaps superseding a reasonable boundary within which you can actually develop the typologies you've developed. And so to me, that makes you and your system very, very adaptive and very able to assimilate interdisciplinary encounters in the way that you have. And that seems to be a skill of yours, is that you're able to take encounters with different disciplines, and rather than them being apparatic to your own discipline and to your own training, you're able to somehow convert them into the chosen vocabulary with which you work and fasten them into place to complement the work you've already done, and perhaps to add to the depth and resonance of certain terms that you're already working with. So that much is very apparent to me, not least because of the series that we just finished doing. But I'm wondering, conversely, whether you've encountered anything in the course of these last months or couple of years in this vast digital forum that has threatened to challenge you perhaps a little bit more, that has perhaps threatened to challenge you with some indigestion. Sure. And that has perhaps threatened that has shaken some of the foundations of your work that you've ported to it. I assume nothing like that has happened so comprehensively as to undermine your project, of course. But I think you're someone who would have a dialectical appreciation for that. Of course. And I'm wondering if it's happened to you recently.
Yeah. Well, so here's the. Absolutely. Yes, there are particular kinds of ideas that, to the extent that they would get metaphysical and ontological traction, they would then result in a appropriate threat to the onto-epistemological architecture that I've constructed, because they would then challenge foundational aspects. And it is the system. At one point, I characterized it, and I think this is a bit erroneous depending on the meaning of the term foundational, but I argued that it is a foundational system. It certainly has a very clear logical structure to it. It is dependent upon the Big Bang. It's dependent upon the cosmic evolutionary processes in particular ways. Okay. So, for example, I definitely got interested in parapsychology. Okay. And wanted to really be clear about because I got convinced very much the way the world is going through aliens right now. Mm-hmm. I encountered parapsychology in a way that I thought it was just BS. And then I encountered it in a particular way that was like, wait, you can't just call it BS. Okay. And there is enough data in the parapsychology world to be very head scratching, in my opinion. Okay. And there certainly is an empirical lineage on Gonsfield experiments and other kinds of things that just are not amenable to simplistic hand waving from an empiricist skeptical point of view that says this is bullshit. Okay. There's something there. At an anecdotal experimental narrative that's very akin to like Tic Tac and the aliens that are, like, so the analogy is like, okay, yeah, people say, oh, there's aliens. There's nobody in the fucking aliens. And then you're like, well, what the hell is this thing that's on radar that advanced pilots are seeing that nobody can detect? And then they bring back and they study and they have to come out and say, it's not us, right? And then maybe it's the Chinese or the Russians, but how the hell do they have technology that doesn't conform to inertial laws? Nobody has any frame of reference for what that would be. Maybe it's a hologram, but that's weird. Okay. So now you have this whole narrative, this anecdotal data evidence thing that affords no readily clear explanation. And I would argue there's parapsychology lines of research that are very similar. Okay. And I would argue, people have near-death experiences. People have other kinds they speak to higher dimensions of reality. All right. That open up windows on aspects of what I'm doing that would then say, yeah, well, clearly it's incomplete and maybe fundamentally wrong. Okay. So those are the kinds of things that would then, sort of potentially threaten. And if there was a clear metaphysical, ontological line of cumulative explanation that I could follow and see. Now, some of them may be very consistent. Yeah, certainly the idea of aliens is not inconsistent with the tree of knowledge. The idea of a really strong cosmic consciousness that we plap into, whereby our brains are more radar than they are actually mediating consciousness. Yeah, that's different. That's a different metaphysics and a different model of psychology. And my system would be much more regulated to heuristic utility, but not really the real game, if that turns out to be the case.
Right.
Okay? So I've encountered these kinds of elements. I'm an academic trained in my own skepticism. I'm a clinician that knows I'm a bullshitter that has egoic justification to know that I'm right. I mean, that's cognitive dissonance 101. I study and teach that. So I know I'm vulnerable to it. And my commitment, very much like John, is a commitment to uncovering self-deception, being aware of my own justificatory state of being, and find stuff that threatens. That's what to me, that's what a serious academic does. And my honest conclusion in each one of those things is that they're powerful pieces of evidence, but no metaphysical ontological clarity behind the evidence that actually affords you something that you can land on that goes beyond sort of agnostic curiosity about the incidents. And there's no causal real explanation that can be generated that fits with anything that allows me to make sense out of it.
Right, right.
So it's just sort of like my brother, youngest brother, he went through an alien transformation, went from no way to, oh my God. And now he's very convinced that aliens have visited us and hung out, and, he's a believer. Mm-hmm. And I respect that. But as I point out to him, every narrative that he gives, like the United States has access, we're in contact with a galactic interfederation of other aliens, that explanatory narrative that then now accounts for this is very weak and filled with all sorts of speculation. Okay. Right. So now you've filled in, you have your empirical thing, and now you've generated a backdrop story that's unbelievably rich, but has huge numbers of things that we don't know. From a scientific skepticism perspective, you're adding huge jumps in relation. So I think the same is true of the ESP and the entire psi phenomena world. I think that it's fascinating to find some of those, but they can't nail it down. You can't bring it in. It's not like there is an alien ship right in front of us that everyone agrees is an alien ship. There are things that are tantalizing, but not enough. So what have I done? Basically, my response to these kinds of things is, well, I now occasionally, I saw Sean Habermas, I'm maybe getting his wrong, but he's an integral theorist who did exo-natural studies. Okay, believed in he was on integral stage and he on talking about his own experience with aliens, his own vision about what he called exo-natural studies. Okay, and basically opened up this whole layer that I would say I was agnostic about, and it was very helpful because it essentially allowed me to draw a circle. Okay, on all the shit that may be real and I'm open to, and if it was actually real, would require a fundamental upgrade in our naturalistic understanding. But I'm also of the opinion that each one of those things is anecdotally interesting, but there is no clear architecture behind it. So it's just you get the window and then you see it, but you don't know what's behind it and you can't make strong claims. So you then stay there. So then I'm like, well, what really am I trying to do? I am working on the endo-naturalistic philosophy. I am interested in understanding this conversation, which is replicable. It's like, well, I'm justifying my narrative to you. I'm tracking yourself. We're engaged in a dynamic verbal and nonverbal behavioral patterns. And we can take any Zoom conversation and begin to apply, and we can replicate that. We can understand that. So I'm definitely, the tree of knowledge is either onto a better ontological map, or at the very least is not a bad heuristic.
Right.
So that's, I'm like, hey, there may be all this other stuff out there. And if it requires a fundamental upgrade, if Big Bang all of a sudden ends up bad as a bad idea, the system takes a serious hit. So there certainly are these potentials. My basic experiences I'm stoned one night in 1997. I draw out this diagram. Every cell in my body is like, oh my God, this is a formula for decoding the world. In the last 20 years, I've been assimilating and integrating naturalistic facts that are in accordance with this schema. And so I'm like, well, I'm happy with it. This is the cumulative knowledge coherence system that I was seeking for me making sense out of the world. That's qualitatively better, at least than what's going on in Psych 101 classes, where people are, basically just pretending like they understand shit and then just handing them concepts that overlap and are completely chaotic. Right. So that's a long-winded answer. Basically, there are certainly some things that threaten. I tend to those. I haven't found anything that fundamentally is confirmable that undermines the system. I'm open to that. I've used that to actually be clear about what actually is the system really shining our light on. It's a natural philosophy. That's really right. That's exactly what it is.
Right, and very pragmatic by the sounds of it, in the commonplace and in the technical sense. To put it simply, by the sounds of it, what you're doing is you're dedicating your attention to making sure that the integrity of the existing structure is maintained properly in an integrative way. However, you're keeping the windows open.
Exactly. Beautifully. That would be the easy way to say it. I had to jump a lot of academic jargon, but I appreciate you summarizing.
No, I needed the jargon to extract the simplicity from it, but that's how I'm seeing it. I mean, and it's interesting what you say about this is something that I've thought quite a bit about as well, that the distinction, and sometimes it's a very, 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 very fine line, the distinction between what I might call a very attentive Socratic ignorance to the possibility that the descriptive structures of the world are flouted by anomalies that gesture to a depth beyond them, which I find no difficulty believing and committing to, and the substitution of an alternate meta-narrative, which to me is a leap, is a leap that actually changes the category of the speculation, right?
Nice. Yep.
Right. I mean, there's more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy, right? That is a deeply, deeply Socratic, that's deeply consonant with a self-conscious Socratic ignorance, and an ironical one at that. And that to me is a perspectival position that has implicit integrity. But that position, strangely enough, I mean, it's a category mistake, and these things happen all the time. So maybe it's not so strange, but that position becomes in our culture conflated with a position that seeks to supersede whatever the accepted narrative is for an alternative that usually has as little integrity as the one that preceded it, maybe less, maybe more, but usually about the same, I think, right? And it is that distinction is precisely the point of tension that I bump up against often in the world when talking to people, because I get quite enthusiastic and giddy, as many people do, about parapsychological phenomenon. And my father growing up passed on, an incredible tradition of ghost stories to me, and I'm still I'm really quite enthralled with the concept of ghosts at every level of resolution, right? And I still find it to be an absolutely fascinating topic for contemplation and even for study. And there's a lot of good work that's been done on the matter, to understand what is meant by that concept and all of its philosophical and indeed theological implications and all of that. But point is that I too I'm disposed to enjoy and be deeply interested in that kind of speculation, for lack of a better word. And yet I find I balk a little bit at when that genuine interest, right? The interest in the anomalous encounter, in the aporetic encounter, ceases to be aporetic as soon as a narrative is projected to assimilate it and to cohere it and to wholly integrate it into the world. And as soon as it becomes something of the world in a codified fashion, even retrofitted with its own taxonomies and typologies and whatnot, it loses, to me, the aporetic value on the basis of which it is desirable in the first place, or if not desirable, at least appreciable, right?
Right, totally.
And so I always think it's such a shame when the numinous encounter with something ghostly there's a haste, and I understand the haste. There's deep reasons for this. Obviously, you could exposit them better than I could, I'm sure, but there are deep reasons to assimilate such encounters and to reverse engineer them into a narrative framing. But to me, their great function is precisely that they remain outside the frame of the narrative.
Love it.
And that is, to me, that is their power of intervention. That there's atopos ought to be atopos, right?
Yep. No, I love that framing. By the way, that's exactly, to me, if we're doing sort of science to spirituality bridging, it would be the psychological capacity to appreciate what you just said and to embody that, I think, is very much connected to the sort of proper balance of awe, of appreciation of anecdote, of appreciation of mystery, of appreciation of the horizon of possibility. And I mean that in the, sort of traditional mystical sense of the possibilities of the universe and its endlessness and confusion, and almost certainly the narrowness with which our particular conservative, scientific, metaphysic ontological structures afford us to understand that. And to me, to hold that, and then at the same time, to when they flip, and then you think you start to explain it as if it's in parallel to the architecture of understanding the scientific worldview built around itself. The pieces of genuine, systematic, intersubjective, empirical, reliable, discoverable phenomena that then, now I'm going to then, like my brother, now I'm going to then start narrating about what the hell, how aliens are hanging out with each other. And it's like, you're so far away from the phenomena now of what, and now your need to have a justified narrative has now taken over, and you've lost touch with what it is that really, and it is the suspension of a grounded natural philosophy on the one hand, with the mystery of possibility and relation that to me is really the cusp of the balancing apex point that affords us the right orientation in the world.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Why would you want to tame that which declines to be tamed, right? And why would you ruin the great irony of being, which is that what is real and true is not the same as what is prehensible. And to me, it does such a, well, you said it very well. It does such a disservice to the entire enterprise of appreciating, in both senses of the term appreciate, the import of such encounters. Why reduce them so? But like I say, those two positions, they're not really even well, one is not even a position per se. It doesn't use propositions to fortify itself, but those two vantages and, from which to witness the world and its emergence are unduly conflated very often, where the skepticism of Socratic ignorance becomes or converts itself somehow into simply an alternative, right? That could just as easily be supplanted by the same Socratic ignorance if it maintained its presence and continuity.
Right.
And it's certainly where I bump up against, right. It's certainly where I find that my perspective ends and others begin, where the genuine love of the aporia becomes the positing of a new world in which the aporia is no longer an aporia.
Mm. Beautiful. Actually, that opens up something I definitely wanted to touch on. And I haven't heard enough of your story, the story about of how you got to be where in this space and in the worldview and your narrative. So I'd really like this to take a little while and, kind of, you talked about your dad and, and embodying that, and that gave me a little window into your past. And it's like, I want to know you better, brother. So can you tell me a little bit about the story that brings you here in this crazy world?
Sure. Yeah. It's an interesting question, because so much of my biography, so to speak, is very unadorned, and it's the fact of it being so unadorned is one of the things that has interested me in it as a phenomenon, and has interested me in its limitations, its explanatory limitations. Mm-hmm. My particular set of interests and dedications, as they may be, are not sufficiently justified by any narrative or any biography that I could adduce to explain them. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a family that was religious in a very nominal sense, was Catholic in a nominal sense. Mm-hmm. And that was both that was probably a lot more significant than I ever gave it credit for in the immediate aftermath. Because what it did do is it habituated the presence of such a thing. For one thing, it engineered a very basic degree of biblical literacy, not enough, but some, and it naturalized the notion of the transcendent into the everyday. So that even when, I came to a certain age where I decided, as a lot of people do, to be as, derisive and irreverent as I possibly could towards the churchly upbringing. And like I say, it wasn't all that churchly, but it was, it was really Catholic in the most common sense, right? Catholics are famous for, going to church twice a year, but it was a far more cultural Catholicism than it was a pious Catholicism. And that's in part because of the cultural background it came from. Right. But there was enough of that so that the notion, attention to the transcendent, survived all of the irreverence that I levied at the levied at the conventions of the church when that time came. And so that appreciation survived a period of rebellion, precisely because it had been naturalized into character as opposed to naturalized into a system of propositional thinking, right? And of course, I since, over the course of time, have realized that that is its function properly, and that the propositional thinking, or that which corresponds to the doctrinal and the dogmatic. And I'm not saying that those don't have important functions or that they're sort of epiphenomenal and inconsequential. That's not what I mean. But what I mean is that the real cynosure of the work, the characterological work, was done well, I would say, and was done properly. And all I needed was an index for that notion, an index that would continue to appreciate such a thing, even as it became costumed in different disguises over the course of time. Right. Anyway, so I was raised with a religious background that appreciated when I would say I was able to return to it, having gotten all of the sort of the piss and vinegar out of my system, so to speak, about it, and return to it with a capacity to actually understand what that project is about. Not that I've reached an endpoint to that or will ever, but so there was enough enculturation of that early enough. And there was an interesting kind of dialectic to it as well, because I grew up in a family that sort of half of it was very attentive to the ritual and to the conventions, right? To all of those customs that comprise, whether it be a liturgy or whether it be, the sacraments within the church, or whether it be the practice of prayer or the practice of worship. I had enough of that kind of dotted along the line so that I had some practical referent or reminder for it. But I also had, and these are sort of represented in some ways by my two parents, right? One was very attentive to the exercises of prayer, the exercises of worship, the exercises of reminding oneself that one actually belonged to that one's life was not simply one's own. You know what I mean? Okay.
You were part of the larger communal.
And that's right. And that you were that I was beholden to dependencies. Beholden to dependencies that had to be regarded and had to be respected, because it simply wasn't all up to me. That's a really key thing. I think it's unfortunately something that I've lost a little bit over the course of time that will eventually I'm going to have to reel in again. But this idea of the necessity of it, right? It's necessary because it's ritual, because it's tradition, because it's what we do, right? It's what we do. And it's funny, that because it's what we do was precisely, and as it always is when a person goes through adolescence, is usually the object of the irreverence. It's usually the object of the disdain.
That's the individualization. Who says?
The presented necessity becomes the object of rebellion, and I was no different. But I have since appreciated that it was presented as an unjustified necessity. Unjustified necessities are really important. And I could never have appreciated the importance of an unjustified necessity, for the one thing. And then on the other hand, to its dialectical opponent was that was more my father. What was this almost a more pantheistic or panpsychic view of the cosmos that kind of eschewed some of the strictures of the formal cosmology, let's say of Christianity, and was much more in love with the apparatic, much more in love with the ghostly. And was much more interested in loosening the restraints of convention in order to open the window a little bit wider for instance, right? And so those two opponents, I think, were deeply, though I didn't realize it for many years, were deeply complementary and kind of, basically equipped me with a great deal. I mean, there was something very helpful that came out of it, and also something of a great struggle that came out of that, because I inherited a great deal of ambivalence. And I'm still a person of great, I'm still a person of great alternation. I forbear from a lot of metaphysical commitments, precisely because they are very competitive within me. They are very competitive within me. And I don't have a great talent for comprehensive, systematic thinking, precisely because I very much feel I am a center of tension of competing forces and influences, each of which on their own day can be incredibly persuasive. Now, fortunately, there is enough harmonization there's enough characterological harmonization. There's enough harmonization there's enough normative harmony, I should say, between those dialectical opponents to create something that is, at least has a certain amount of let's say, ontological continuity and existential continuity. But I do find that the quality that characterizes my relationship with philosophy and with theology, for that matter, and all of their children, is one of deep ambivalence. And it's interesting, on a bad day, that ambivalence is completely sundering. And on a good day, the taut tension in that ambivalence is very fertile and is a source of great, very generative, possibility and insight and love and creation. And so, anyway, and so that ambivalence for me persisted. I went to the University of Toronto, which is where I met John, and that ambivalence was running through me all the while. And one of the things that in meeting John, and I shouldn't make it seem as though John was the only good instructor I ever had. That's certainly not the case. I had others that were deeply influential for me, but they were more sparing than they should have been. And one of the things that immediately the immediate affinity that I felt when I met John and became his student was that he was also a victim to that ambivalence.
Yep.
Now, John has resolved that ambivalence a great deal.
But he carries the affective memories.
He does. You're absolutely right. He carries the affective. That very well said, Greg. Carries the affective memory of that ambivalence, and it's still present. It's not simply a thing of the past, I think, for him. I hope he wouldn't mind me saying that. I don't think he would.
I think he has announced that on a couple of different podcasts, so that I consider that public.
And that was the thing that endeared me so to him, is that he was at once a scientifically minded, highly rigorous, a scholarly thinker, and yet had a deeply religious nature, a deeply spiritual nature.
Yes.
And that was, now I'm not, certainly don't have the scientific aptitude or interest that he has, but the affect of the ambivalence was very similar. And I was deeply admiring and quite enthralled, actually, at the way that he had resolved his ambivalence toward his own religious background and managed to somehow, and I still think it's quite miraculous that he was able to do this, that he had rekindled and rediscovered a deep and abiding love for its project, in spite of the fact that it had been so dissatisfying in so many ways.
Wow.
and that combination was a very, very powerful affinity to put aside, the fantastic pedagogy and all that, but that affectively and socially.
Right. In terms of what he would embody for you in relation.
That's right. So that, that ambivalence is something that's really, that is characteristic of the way I approach this arena, the way I approach my own thinking, the way I approach the thinking of other people. And like I say, there's a vice to it. And the vice is a kind of non-committal refrain. And that's not always a good thing. But the virtue of it, perhaps, is a persistent openness and a rather almost aesthetic a palette for the possibility of looking at the cosmos in a variety of different ways, right down to the experience of the individual. And one thing that I think I enjoy doing, sometimes at my own peril, is to carry or keep in mind or in carriage conflicting or disharmonious possibilities at one time, right? So
what about your intellectual flowering? I experience you in a unique way. Your capacity for eloquence and prose and the depth with which you are able to relate to people, empathize, narrate, weave synergistic concepts together, and then articulate them in the here and now is just beautiful, and I'm curious as to what, if that experience of having that capacity at such a high level, how do you kind of experience the world in relationship to that, or how does the world experience you in relationship to that unique feature?
Oh, well, that's very kind of you, Greg. Thank you. That's a good question. Well, it's definitely, it has something to do with, if I am to accept your premise.
We can accept the premise. I appreciate the hesitancy because you're humble, but I gave you the premise. You can look at the comments from Guy Senstock in the notes after of the session you lead, and we can get additional confirmatory analysis.
Well, Guy's my buddy now, so I can't rely on him to be.
Well, all right, I'm your buddy too, but I'm also a clinician, and I've hung around a lot of smart people. I feel comfortable with my assessment.
All right. Well, I'll take it in good faith and not demur anymore. So yeah, I think it has something to do with the combination of artistic and intellectual impulses, or I think that I struggled quite a lot, and still do, when I was a student, to reconcile attractions to both of those domains, to a domain that was overtly artistic, and a domain that was overtly or exclusively intellectual. Now, of course, we know anyone who's cultivated some degree of integrity over the course of time knows that there's no essential contradiction between those things, and that they can coexist and cohabitate. But vocationally, they don't always cooperate with one another. And so when I was a student, I was really torn by those competing influences and appetites, and found that I could become a vessel upon which either domain could project onto me. Right. And I do feel like I'm often the host of projections from both of those domains. I've been, and I suppose sometimes it's a rather luxurious problem to have, but it is a problem that I feel claimed in some ways by both of those domains, and therefore have an exclusive home in neither, which was always my my difficulty as a student was that I was a relatively homeless student. I kind of flitted from one thing to another, from one program to another, from one department to another. And I was never able to fully resolve into a consistent, harmonious structure the eclecticism of all of those competing interests. And I think in part because I could never decide whether my own temperament commended me to a more artistic life or whether it commended me to a more intellectually rigorous and scholarly life. And in many ways, that kind of schism, the divorce of those cultures does persist, I think, because there's, first of all, like I realized quite early on that I was not able, for instance, to devour knowledge in the same way that other people were able to, right? Now, obviously, having John as such a close friend has given me even a more radically disproportionate view of such a thing, because I think he devours things so voraciously that most people couldn't keep up. But even so, those people that I knew, and I knew many who were really committed to the scholarly life, had a kind of drive to consume and digest as much material as possible. And I was much more distractible. I was much more, I preferred to write more on any given day necessarily than I did to read, although it would alternate and change. And so I always found that the kind of focus, the kind of dedicated focus and singularity of purpose and singularity of intent, that is almost kind of requisite if you're going to be able to espouse a deep and thorough expertise in any one domain. That focus, that singularity of purpose eluded me. And does still elude me. And so that for me is the tension. That is the tension for me is having a temperament that likes to wander and daydream. I do a lot of that. That likes to get lost in the interior life of possibility, that wanders in imagination and likes to concoct structures in that interior life that become satisfying unto themselves, playfully satisfying unto themselves, and trying to develop much more well-defined, much more to develop faculties of greater specificity and faculties of greater discipline that can actually lend a more systematic structure to the influences of the world and tame them and create from them a scaffold upon which to climb and upon which to build. And the kind of focal dedication required to do that is something that has always come within range and then drifted out of range, within range and drifted out of range. Anyway, so I digress. That helps
me, and I think just the narrative of who you are and what you bring. And so one of the things that sort of defines the podcast, I'm going to throw out it's seeking a coherent naturalistic ontology that seeks to revitalize the human soul and spirit in the 21st century. That's the frame. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about is kind of like, you hooked in with John, and then you've sort of, through John and then your own space, you've sort of watched some of the transformations that have taken place. And you also now embodies, ambivalence and depth and, a science, spirituality, dialectic. You just articulated all of that. So when you look out kind of at the kairos of the moment and the time between worlds, what's your sense? What do you see as happening, or what do you hope to happen? What do you fear might happen? Where are you feeling about this thing, whatever this thing that emerging is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that I look at it in two. There's sort of two ways, I think, of, and they're not by any means mutually exclusive, but there are two arenas in which we can see the meaning crisis playing itself out. And the work I did with John initially, all of the work initially over the course of the first few years had everything to do with the meaning crisis and articulating it out into its component parts, its component symptomology. And there is, of course, the kind of cultural arena in which we can see the loss of no longer having a kind of cosmic arbiter to fasten, constrain, and ultimately frame the normativity of our experience. That now in the articulation of the orders in the way that John and I framed them, that's not the only thing at stake. The normativity, there's the the nomos of the world, and there's the narrative order of the world. But the normativity to me is in many ways the one that comes to mind first, because it has to do with what we are to do with ourselves, and so no longer having a normativity that can effectively arbitrate and instill the presence of truth without making that sense of truth unduly imminent to us is, I think, the problem chiefly to me in that arena, which is to say that now we compete in our accounts for what should arbitrate the normativity of action. And all that means is that we cut ourselves up into finer and finer and finer and finer and finer objects, and continue to distend and lose our sense of coherence. And all of everything having to do with the so-called culture wars and the whole issue of political correctness and the rise of Peterson and everything that came from that.
Right.
Clearly, right, everything that has been decried on all sides of that phenomenon makes it very clear that whatever it is that can concenter our normativity is completely dissipated. And so that's sort of one domain. And then the other domain, and the domain I think that I take a lot more personal interest in, is the domain of the interior life. And that's what brought me to Kierkegaard, for instance, right? That's why people like him, I think, have a great deal to teach us at a time like this, because the cultivation of subjective experience is something that we increasingly outsource. We outsource it. Now, it's funny. There is a certain developmental utility, I should think, about outsourcing a certain amount of subjective accountability to a culture, if that culture was actually effectively able to graduate and monitor and then eventually return us to ourselves, right? So that's what we do as kids, right? Kids, your accountability as an individual is outsourced to the necessity of your parent. And then at some point that accountability returns to you, and whatever the narrative of childhood that ordered the cosmos very neatly, if you're lucky enough to have had a peaceful childhood, of course, is revealed to be a kind of noble lie, right? It's not true, but what it did is it indexed attention to what was ultimate and provisionally rendered in such a way that your attention would be fastened to the right objects in the world. Right? Right. That's why we tell lies. That's why we don't mind telling lies to kids, because the propositional content of the lie is actually serving as as a tool to fasten commitments to certain patterns of encounter, patterns of behavior, right?
Right. We know that this is what we do.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Right. This is what you do, right? Why? Well, because of this. And that's not really because of that, right? But that it becomes a way of scaling the imperative to act in a certain way and scaling it in such a way that the reasons for it are digestible, but of course become increasingly untenable as you grow and you realize that you can't see the world in two dimensions. Anyway, so my point is that being able to outsource, to being able to loan out and then retrieve the accountability of becoming yourself is something that only actually works, I think, if you have a cultural matrix that's actually cosmologically coherent enough to be able to actually return you to yourself at the end.
If only we had such a thing.
If only we had such a thing. And that's precisely what we don't have. We don't, like, because we can't. And this becomes to me a source of great mistrust in the world. I do not entrust myself to a community, because I am afraid that if I entrust myself to that community will ultimately betray me. It will ultimately betray my capacity to become myself, when the becoming of that self is ultimately must in its specificity, in its singular actuality, must actually be greater than the sum of traits that comprise that community, right?
Do you see the seeds of that potential community that would be up to that task?
I see only seeds. I see only seeds. I'm not yet. I mean, like, this enterprise to me has a great deal of promise, and I'm endeared to it, and it has already given me a great deal. But I am not yet at the point where I'm ready to invest. And again, everything I've just told you, you can sense that that's partly because that seems to be my complexion. But part of that is my complexion. But I can come up with some justifications for it as well, because I don't yet trust that there is any. I mean, it would ideally be the church, but that is yet one other that I don't feel like I can outsource my sense of personal trust and accountability to, and trust that it will actually return me to myself at a crucial juncture. And that is also the way I feel about any number of nascent would-be spiritual or religious communities that are perfectly respectable and whose bona fides at face value I commend and I trust. But I think that something would indeed have to be the call of one of those communities would have to be so singularly piercing, so trenchant, so exact, that I actually don't know what it would take. I don't know what it would take to have those affections won over, right? To have that trust won over, because I still think that the response to the meaning, I mean, I've done work to this effect with John. Obviously, there is some there has to be some collective manifestation of a response to the meaning crisis, if only as a consequence of the individual. Right? Obviously, this has to operate at the level of culture, and I don't mean to say that individual life is the only level of resolution upon which this plays out. Obviously, that's not true. But I do think that that salvation as a possibility, if I can pull in some overtly religious language, salvation as a possibility, I think is within reach of the individual, but I think is I'm not sure that it is yet within reach of the culture. I think that's going to take a great deal more time. I think that's going to take a great deal more time. And so obviously there's a deep interpenetration between the arena of the inner life, the individual's subjective experience, and the cultural matrix in which things play out at a more macrocosmic scale. Obviously,
Sure.
they are coextensive in some way, right? I'm enough of a Platonist to believe that there's a coextensive nature, but I also think that I look out at the field of culture, and I see that it has managed to vivisect itself into so many. There are so many appendages out there without a brain to cohere them. You know what I mean? And there are so many weltering limbs out there that are grasping without knowing what they're grasping at.
What an image. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And I look out at them and I think I got to keep away from this.
Yeah.
I got to keep away from this. Right. And even when one emerges that seems intelligible enough to be worthy of some trust, I'm tempted to give that trust only provisionally, because I think that because there's also a certain there are, as you said before, there are egoic interests to those communities that also constrain their capacity to accommodate their opponents.
Yep.
Right, that constrain their capacity to accommodate their opponents, and so in any case, the sort of the individual arena is the one that eludes itself to me with beckons with a little bit more beckons with a little bit more promise than the cultural one to me right now.
Right. And cultivate the local garden.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Because, I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
And I have it in me to believe that that there is renewal here. I really do. I truly do. But I don't know what we're going to have to go through in the meantime before such a thing becomes capable of being an actuality, and I'm reticent to prognosticate any more than that, right? Because who knows? I mean, the last 18 months, like none of us saw that coming, and I think that what that did is this is a pretty obvious thing to say. It exacerbated all of those things that were already rife through the symptomology of that meaning crisis, were exacerbated. Right. One of the things that people realized, I think, and I don't exclude myself from this, is that we are untutored when it comes to cultivating the inner arena. We cannot keep our own company. We're just woefully ill-equipped to keep our own company. And because of that, we offload more and more of that personal sense of presence, that personal accountability that has us recur on ourselves and wonder aloud at our own integrity. We offload more of that to the conventions of culture. And when we do that, then we simply abdicate what it means to be ourselves, right? And I think that's becoming more true. Not less true.
Certainly, I would say that we're moving in the wrong direction as far as that goes in general. But I think you're making a very powerful point, and certainly the attention to the interior and the cultivation of the interior garden, and both the capacity and the ability to do that is always, for those that can reflect on it and understand what it would mean to cultivate that and be able to have that available to them, is absolutely key. And it is certainly one of the things that I would encourage people to reflect on deeply in relationship as they position themselves in relationship to society. There's local and global variations on which one would draw one's attention, and one is always present with oneself, in that. And then to turn the attention there is always, I think, a worthwhile, I don't think only, but always a worthwhile place to, Jordan Peterson, clean your room at whatever level of meaning that affords.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that I mean, just because it's a reflexive exercise doesn't mean that it's a solitary exercise.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key here, right? Like, I don't mean for a second that we should be retreating into further into solitude and isolation as a means of interrogating our sense of our own presence. That's not it at all. Right. I think that there is a component of that project, I think, that does require solitude, that does require the privacy of one's inner life. But by no means do I think that that's primarily or exclusively the way to that project. I think, in fact, the cultivation, like the fellowship, the cultivation of intimates is essential to that. For me, it has been essential to that project.
Absolutely.
There's no way I would have been able to grasp as many features of my own being were it not for the dedicated influences and feedback from people who are close to me. And I think and every person I know who has undertaken that kind of project has also needed the same thing.
Completely.
But I think that's also one of the challenges, is that one of the things that project, I think, requires is the presence of intimate, attentive fellows. And that's another thing that's very hard to come by right now, right? Because the art of sociability, and it is an art, it is something that you can do better or do worse, right? Just like conversation is something that you can do better and do worse. And some of the acuity and the training that goes into cultivating that skill, I think, has attenuated over the course of time. I meet a lot of people, again, this is anecdotal, not statistical, but in my own life, I meet a lot of people, especially of my cohort, my generation, who do not have intimate, personal friends. They have people that they see, they have people that they see by virtue of shared circumstance, right? And that's valuable in and of itself, obviously, but it's valuable in a different way, right? Or they have like partners, right? And that's also valuable for its own reasons, but that's also not quite the same thing. And so I think that, again, this is only anecdotal, but it is very, very pronounced in my experience, is a paucity of those kinds of intimate friendships. Because the thing about intimate friendships is what they do is they attend to you as they attend to you singularly. They attend to you not in a categorical manner, right?
Yep.
That's their great power, is to be seen for your singular nature, for your irreducible quality, for better and for worse, right? And both are necessary. And I think that as the culture becomes more vivisected into its tribal parts and pieces, the basis of relating becomes the shared normativity that is speciated in each of those tribal parts, right? I relate to this group on the basis that we have now this shared ideological way of regarding the world, and it's on that basis that I relate to that group. But if that's the basis on which I relate to people, that has nothing to do with myself as an individual, unique in any capacity. It has nothing to do with me, right?
Yep.
And it has nothing to do with them. It is simply, a particular asp under which we congregate, and when we refer to that as our identity. But of course, as we know, that identity is ultimately fraudulent, and the only way to properly relate to it is to relate to it ironically, because we are precisely not reducible to it, right? And so I think that that level of relationship is a crucial cultural missing piece of the puzzle that is absolutely necessary to mediate between the cultivation of the individual arena and all of its singularity, and then the broader cultural arena in which these individuals cultivated bring themselves to bear and are able to identify with communities, but simultaneously and crucially disidentify with those communities at the very same time, so that they don't become subsumed under
preserve their individuation.
That's right. Exactly right. To preserve their individuation. And I think that we have right now a situation of extremes. We have individuated individuals who cannot find a place for themselves in the world because every place they see in the world is categorical. And they look out at the world and say, well, I can't participate in any of these groups because I don't see myself in the categorical way that they seem to see themselves. It's a problem I have all the time, right? I look at all of these groups and they, and I think I can't be part of that because I fundamentally don't understand myself to be that. And to the extent that I could participate in that, I would have to do so ironically. I would have to do so constantly reminded of the fact that I am not equivalent to the denominating identity that characterizes that way of being.
Right.
And I think so community for me, the necessity of community, the thing that would make community on a mass scale much more livable has something to do with one that could live in the tension of that irony, right? In which we could be as a part, because we do, right? As Tillich says, right? The be as a part is deeply important, but in order to be as a part, we must understand ourselves also simultaneously and dialectically as not as a part. And it's somehow the resolution of those dialectical opponents that I think would make such a thing viable. And I don't know, frankly, what would make it viable for me or in general. I don't know what would make it viable, but that's what it is right now to me. To me, the being as a part within the culture right now is a non-starter, precisely because all of it, to me, not all of it, but you take my meaning, Greg, the vast majority of it. Yes. I'm not saying there aren't exceptions, but the vast majority of it is too categorical to be authentic. And that's a problem because I want to be as a part as much as anybody does. Right. And yet, if I can't find an arena that will allow me to maintain the elasticity of identity required to continue to aspire, then I don't want any part of it at all. Right. So this is the dilemma, my friend, as far as
I hear it. You've articulated it brilliantly.
It's one axis of the dilemma anyway. There's so many.
There are a lot of different angles. We can specialize lots of different dilemmas. And I think we elucidated that one with a fair degree of richness. And I do think it's a poignant condition. And this idea of self in relationship to other, self in relationship to culture, society, and the process by which that iterative feedback loop is conducive to fulfillment on both ends, or sort of fragmented, categorical, deconstructive in relation, and then alienating. And of course, I certainly see us, unfortunately leaning toward the latter reality. Although I do see pockets certainly of awakening. I think, the response to the whole idea of a meaning crisis and that entering into our vocabulary and the ease with which that has been taken up, and the notion that there is then a diagnosis and awareness of that with a frame, that has caught a particular angle of a subset, and the idea that we would want a self-society system that affords much richer meaning, both in terms of our individuation and our participation in groups and various, higher purposes. I think there's a calling for that. I think there's a seeking for that. And I think there's hope that the seedlings that we are seeing may actually take root and grow. But there's a hell of a lot of headwinds, no doubt about that, and a lot of inertial force that fractures and fragments. So my mode, in terms of vacillation, is that I can activate the hope and optimism. And at the same time, I have a pessimistic realism side, and I can do my John Vervaeke lens and then add one and see the world through both, and aspectualize both those features with a high degree of resolution. And we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. And it's not as though life is not completely gray, even in the midst of this,
Yeah, no, and at a personal level, my own little experience over the last 2 years is of transformation. I mean, there's definitely been a transformation into a community after banging my head up against a wall and getting inside the academy, thinking that the academy should be the place where this thing is seated. And then, sort of losing that hope over the years in some ways, and then being launched into a community where I don't know if it's seated, but I'm at least encountering John and equivalent kind of structures and ideas in the world that actually have, I've certainly found my people in a particular way and have had a sense of fellowship in a way in the last 2 years of my own life that I really hadn't had in the first, 25 years of my journey into this endeavor that I find myself in.
Yeah. And that is, but like, God, that is not something to be underestimated. The power.
No, that's felt at multiple levels of my own, layered existence. And I feel it at each one. And I can speak to that at both when it's not there and now to feel enough of it to see the experience of that and the harmonizing of that and the potential of that. It's I'm a happy camper, no doubt about that.
Yeah. And I think it's also, I agree. And I also content myself in a certain amount of ignorance and a certain amount of belief in the absence of comprehension, like this. I mean, despite all of my personal misgivings and mistrusts, I nevertheless am bringing myself to the table, and there's something about it that does feel, sometimes in spite of myself, sometimes in spite of the rational justificatory part of my thinking, there's something that feels intuitively right about it, and I'm willing to give myself over to that intuition, even if there are reasons to abstain, and then the tension between that seems to be right, seems to be very important.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Well, we're maybe coming to a possible stopping point. Was there anything when you entered into this were there any particular topics that you were especially hoping to share or circle into as we enter today?
That's a good question. I kind of had no idea, Greg. I came in thinking we would just figure it out as we went along, and that's
Amen.
What we did. Thank you. I thought, I had some things I could have asked you if we needed fodder for conversation, but I don't think we did. I think we were fine.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing your story, and I think you've embodied one of the great challenges of self and society in our particular cultural dilemma. And this is the fundamental question, is whether we can build a rich and differentiated culture with all the smorgasbord of opportunities that speaks to the potential complexity of the individual lives and holds and honors them in a way that's reciprocally growth fulfilling. It's a beautiful dialectical aspect on the meaning crisis, and if we were able to solve it or address it in a particular way that's healing or not. And I feel like you brought your experience around that tension in a way that elucidates that it really enlivens it and embodies it and makes it, affords it in a way that I think is very meaningful in hearing that story and basically thinking about your sort of, often talk about people's baton of energy information across, and what is it that the struggle or the opportunity or the tragedy and the way it presents itself. And I really appreciate the way you presented that and that journey. It was very, very meaningful to me.
Thank you, Greg. It was to me too. And you invited the confidence. And so I was happy to talk to you on a little bit more of a personal level about these things. And I think in some ways, maybe that's the best I can do here, is to offer up myself up as an embodied sample of these tensions, because I think in some ways that's what I am. I don't know I don't know what great theoretical contributions I'm going to be able to make in the direction of this problem, but perhaps one thing I can do is try and become as conscious a sample of these dilemmas as possible, a thinking sample of these dilemmas, and offer myself up on to the altar of this problem in the hopes that in some modest way, perhaps it will it will contribute to the wisdom, if only accidentally.
No, I mean, certainly from my vantage point, these are the dynamic interrelations that ultimately we need to wrestle with. And by your virtue of narrating them, you bring them in high lived resolution. So I deeply appreciate that.
Thank you, Gregg. Thank you.
All righty, friend. Well, thanks so much for spending the hour and a half with me. I've deeply enjoyed it, as I knew I would. And also thanks so much for your articulations in the Elusive. I definitely, like I said, let me re-echo that was meaningful, and just, the intersection that I've had with so many interesting people. And I certainly count you among them, and the emerging fellowship here. I deeply, deeply appreciate that.
Thanks, Gregg. I feel very fortunate to have met you and to have developed this rapport with you. And I really hope to carry it forward. So I feel quite lucky, and thank you. Thanks for being here with me. Thank you for the conversation.
All right, man. All right. Well, take care, friend.
Okay. You too.
All right.